We're going to get started. It is 12:01 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you everyone for joining us. My name is Greta Zaro and I'm the organizing director of World Beyond War. And I'm really excited to kick off day one of our virtual No War 2020 conference. This had been planned as our in-person 5th annual global conference for Ottawa, Canada. And then with everything going on with the coronavirus pandemic, as you know, everything has had to be shifted to a virtual event. And so this is our first time doing an entirely virtual conference. We have been doing a webinar series for 3 years and now using this format for our conference. So all of the participants, you should be muted. Please keep yourselves muted for the first portion of this workshop. First, we'll hear from Mary-Wynne, who will be talking about different strategies for effective nonviolence on the personal level, on the community level, on the international level, and how we can apply those in our daily lives. We'll hear a presentation from Mary-Wynne, and then we'll go into breakout rooms. And so when we go into the breakout room portion, you will have a chance to unmute yourselves and share your thoughts. But for now, stay muted, please. And we are recording this webinar, so if you have to leave at any point, we will send you the link to the recording afterwards. And we're also live streaming on World Beyond War's YouTube channel right now. So before I hand it over to Mary-Wynne, I just want to give her a better introduction. So Mary-Wynne is a retired family physician with a specialty in palliative care. She was co-president of the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War for 4 years and president of Physicians for Global Survival in Canada for 4 years. IPFNW received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1985. She has received many awards for her work, including the Governor General's Medal on 2 occasions and the Washington Physicians for Social Responsibility Distinguished Physician Award in the name of Sir Paul Beeson. In 2016, the University of Calgary named her as their distinguished graduate. She received the 2019 Medal of Excellence from the Doctors of BC and the Cam Cody Foundation. Her award-winning book, Enough Bloodshed, 101 Solutions to Violence, Terror, and War, has been translated into both Japanese and Korean. Mary-Wynne and Dr. Jonathan Down received the 2019 National Achievement Award from Canadians for a Nuclear Weapons Convention, an organization of 1,000 members of the Order of Canada who support the treaty to prohibit nuclear weapons. The award was for their work over the past 2 years, teaching almost 2,000 high school students about nuclear weapons and the ban treaty. So welcome, Mary-Wynne. Thank you so much for joining us, and I'm going to hand it over to you to get started.
Thank you very much, Greta, and good morning, everyone. At least it's morning for me in Victoria. It's really a pleasure to be with so many people who are concerned about peace. I just feel like I've come home. So thank you for coming. I'm going to be talking about 4 case studies. Case stories, I think, is a better way to put it. So I'm just going to go to share my screen and let you see the slides as I go along. There we go. So my book is called 101 Solutions to Violence, Terror, and War. And when I wrote it, I'd signed a contract with a publisher and I knew about 50 solutions, but I had a terrible feeling there might only be 50. Well, I can tell you there are hundreds, if not thousands, of successful examples where nonviolence has been used to end aggression and war. So I want to start by just telling you what was happening between 1991, when the Cold War ended, and 2007. There were extraordinary changes in the world, and I'm relying on a report from the Center for Human Security from University of British Columbia. They put out reports annually starting, I think, in 2005. And the results are quite astonishing. So here we go. Major wars and genocides decreased 90% between 1991 and 2006, and 100 wars quietly ended. 61 dictators were toppled between 86 and 2005, and only Romania had significant violence. I mean, that was huge violence in the massacre of the leaders. But Other than that, they were nonviolent revolutions. And that was updated in 2011 when a report I heard on NPR said that 85 dictators have been toppled nonviolently. Armed conflicts in general, that means ones with fewer than 1,000 battle deaths in a year, decreased by 40% between 1991 and 2007. Terrorism went down between 2001 and 2008, went down by 40%. Same reporting researchers. So they ask, why are we turning away from war? And the researchers gave three answers. They said it was the increasing effectiveness of the United Nations, the increasing role of international law, and the increasing power of civil society. And I have added the increasing role of women because I can see that again and again in the different responses that I'm going to be talking about. First of all, the United Nations. This is a report from the RAND Corporation, which is certainly not left-wing. And they reported that 67% of UN nation-building initiatives have been successful. That's really a very high success rate. We know from the United Nations that 70% of workers for peace and social justice are women. This is a picture from Sri Lanka, where the women were going out as a group to rescue their children who'd been snatched up as child soldiers. And they were successful along with the help of peace brigades and UNICEF. So I'm going to start, I put these in historical order because it just maybe makes a bit more sense. This is Women's Strike for Peace in 1961. This is an astonishing thing that happened when the women in the United States discovered that the atmospheric testing of nuclear weapons was causing the deposit of strontium-90, radioactive strontium, in baby teeth that they had collected after their 5 and 6-year-old children lost their teeth. By extension, we know that if there was strontium-90 in baby teeth, it was also in their bones, in the children's bones, and in the adults' bones. And at that point, 100,000 women marched in 60 cities in the United States. They were charged with un-American activities and had to appear, they were subpoenaed, 20 of them, to appear before the House Committee of Senator McCarthy in 1961, or two, I'm sorry. And more than 20 volunteered. They rushed to the opportunity to be able to testify to this committee. And each woman, regardless of her age, took with her a toddler under the age of 2, cribs, prams, strollers, bottles, diapers, and so on. And they all converged in this hearing room. When the senator asked for the leader to please speak out, they all looked at each other and said, "Oh, who was the leader? Gosh, we don't have a leader, actually," which was very frustrating. Then one of the women was called to come up and testify, and she said, "Oh, just a moment, Senator, I just have to feed the baby," and began to breastfeed. There was chaos in the room, as you can imagine, with all these toddlers crying and running around. And finally, the hearing was closed. And the women are credited with this being the beginning of the end of those House hearings on un-American activities. Women's Strike for Peace continued for about the next 30 years. And there may be offshoots from it that other people can talk about. Second example I want to talk about is Track 2 diplomacy. And the example I'm going to use is the one that I'm really familiar with, which is IPFNW, the International Physicians for Prevention of Nuclear War. This group was formed in 1981 by the two cardiologists, the doctors on the left there. Yevgeny Chazov is shaking hands with Gorbachev, and the next one is Bernard Lown. These were two of the world's preeminent cardiologists. Lown invented the defibrillator. Chazov was the personal physician to the leaders of the Soviet Union and founded their very, very modern cardiology institute. Lown said to Chazov in 81, "You know, Yevgeny, the greatest threat to public health today is not what we've been working on, sudden death in young men under 40. It really is the danger of nuclear war. And you and I need to found an organization of doctors to come forward and tell the public, in the case of a nuclear war, medicine has nothing meaningful to offer. We have to prevent this war. And so began this organization that by 1985 had somewhere well over 100,000 doctors around the world. And in 85, that's when they won we won the Nobel Peace Prize. This is an example where the reason I put it in is that it was one of the first examples of crossing ideologic boundaries. Laun insisted on going and speaking in the Soviet Union, and Chazov spoke in the United States. They told people that the stereotypes that we had of the enemy were simply not true. That in particular, I can remember Laun talking about meeting Soviet doctors with great hugs and friendship. This began exchanges that included one that was a space bridge with broadcasts from a studio in the United States and one in Moscow with audiences in both places. And when the cameras came on simultaneously and people could see the audience on the other side and they realized that they could say hello, they all began to wave to each other across the world. That was really a new first. So track 2 diplomacy is a really important innovation, I suppose you would say, of conflict resolution, because it means that people who don't have a stake in power or money or the military are meeting and speaking together, and they're breaking down barriers and building understanding between countries. Just go on to the next one. This is a photograph from the overthrow of Ferdinand Marcos. Marcos was the dictator known as the Hitler of the East. He was a dictator from 1966 to 86 in the Philippines. And toward the end, he became really very brutal. What happened here was not sudden. It appeared, I suppose, to us in the West as if suddenly all of the people had a revolution. But what was really happening was that the Catholic Church, which had formerly had a relationship they called constructive cooperation with the government, really began to turn against the government completely. And there were meetings in church basements all over the Philippines. People were gathering and
we know that.
talking about when a time might come when it would be an opportunity to change things. So they were prepared. What happened was that 4 officers rebelled against Marcos and locked themselves in a building in the downtown area. And Marcos sent in the tanks to take them out. Cardinal Sin went on Catholic radio and said to the people, go to the streets and stay there until Marcos leaves. Something like 4 million people went into the streets, and they had to camp there overnight. They stayed there for 4 solid days, and eventually Marcos left. The other wonderful thing about the Philippine experience is that they documented everything, so that after all of this was finished, they were able to hand over their strategies to other places, and Colombia is one example that I think of, that benefited from the lessons learned. This was in 1986 then. And certainly those lessons were applied by the time we got to 1989 and the fall of the Berlin Wall. This is one of my favorite stories. I'm trying to give you a broad spectrum. So women, non-governmental organizations, one of the revolutions, and now the role of cities. And this man, Antonis Maccas from Bogota, has been written up many times, and you can find reference to him in the Harvard Gazette if you want to Google him. So he was a mathematics professor with also a degree in philosophy, I think, and he decided that there had to be something more important than teaching university students about mathematics. So he ran for mayor of Bogota. At that time, Bogota was one of the most violent places, probably in the world, but certainly one of the most violent in Latin America, with a very high homicide rate, terrible cases of women being mugged if they went into the downtown area, and their purses would be stolen by gangs of little kids. People were resentful and angry. So he came in determined to do a social experiment. First thing, he fired all of the corrupt traffic police and he replaced them with pantomime artists. So this guy has a sign that says incorrecto. He's in the crossing there, and he's pointing out to people that they are crossing not in the crosswalk or they're crossing against a light. This made everybody laugh. When they first encountered these traffic police, they all slowed down, and traffic deaths dropped by an enormous percent, I think 50%. He talked to the men and said, the women really need free time and they need to be able to go downtown in safety. So we're going to declare 3 nights when the women can go downtown and go into the cafes and bars, and there will be outdoor concerts, and the men can stay at home and look after the children. Well, a couple of 100,000 of the men objected, and Marcos said, Maccas said, well, that's all right. I didn't mean that the men had to stay at home. I thought it would be lovely if they were at home with the children, but if they need to go into the downtown, they can write themselves a letter of safe passage and go into the downtown area. So 700,000 women went into the downtown for 3 nights, and it changed the whole atmosphere, the culture of the country. The other thing that Maccas did that was really interesting was that there was a drought, and they were having a very difficult time getting people to conserve water. So he went on television and took a shower. You can actually see pictures of this if you Google it. He took a shower, turned on the water, got wet, turned off the water, put on the soap, turned on the water, and rinsed himself off. And water consumption dropped by 40%. I give you this example for two reasons. One is that the role of cities has become more and more important in the world. As populations become concentrated in cities, cities will have populations in the millions and tens of millions, so that some of them are bigger than the populations of small countries. We have to look at how this is changing power, because the power dynamics in city elections are different from national politics. So that's one thing. And the second thing is the role of creativity and humor is extraordinary, and it comes up again and again. It came up with the women making fun of the House Un-American Activities Committee, and it comes up with Maccas and with other ones that I am sure that you're going to think of. Sorry, I'm just going to stop there. I'm going to stop screen share for a minute. There we go. And just tell you a few more things about nonviolence. When we look at why nonviolence succeeds, and this is what I hope you'll discuss in your groups, there are so many background features that we need to explore. I just want to mention a few of them. One is the underlying culture of the country. Does that country already have a culture of nonviolent conflict resolution, traditions perhaps that they have? Is religion a force for unity or a force of hostility within the country, so that you know whether religious leaders are going to be helpful to you or not? What is the role of women? We know from some research by Caprioli that countries where women have rights, meaning the rights to marry at the age when they decide and to whom they decide, the right to determine how many children they'll have, the right to work outside the home, and the right to stand for office, right to vote and the right to stand for office. Those countries are 30 times less likely to have a civil war than the countries where women don't have those rights. That's amazing. So it tells us about the important role of women in bringing about a climate where peace is possible, where discussions are possible. We need to look at the media of countries, and I'll just mention to you that there have been a series of 3 programs on the CBC in Canada, CBC Radio, programs involving the myths of military promoted by Hollywood, and I think they're very important documentaries to listen to, so I recommend them to you to search them out. They've just been in the past couple of weeks. But in particular, the role of the Pentagon in influencing Hollywood film productions and television is an extremely important part in developing a culture that really idealizes military coercion by force and war. It tells us that solving problems about conflict doesn't come down to just looking at people and getting them to be kinder to each other. It also means examining our whole culture and saying, what is it here that is promoting violence as a means of resolving conflict or as a tool of foreign policy? Other ones, I'm just thinking of the other predispositions toward peace. Is the population educated? Can they be reached through various different forms of written media? And now that would be social media. So what's the role of the social media in a particular country? What's the role of oppression of free discussion and freedom of speech? What is the history of human rights? And how is that being addressed by the people? And then the final one I talk about is just what is going on with civil society groups in the underground. It's the role of civil society in the time that I've been involved in the peace movement has just been breathtaking. When I started going to the United Nations, I started my anti-nuclear weapons work in 1984 and was invited to go to the UN third session, special session on disarmament in 88. And at that time, the Canadian government took us as advisors, which was really groundbreaking. Since that time, well, and then a few years later, NGOs really had a great deal of difficulty getting into the different sections when they went to the UN conferences on disarmament, that there was kind of a sense from governments that they had to protect themselves from all of this civil society intrusion. Now that has really changed. That has changed particularly with the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, where speakers from civil society were invited as experts to speak to the conferences on the humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. So that's been an extremely important change. We're also seeing the change at the United Nations. I just became aware recently that the chairman of the Security Council has monthly meetings now with civil society organizations where he actually has a dialogue. The presidency of the Security Council changes every month. So each month a new president declares, and there have been 26 of these dialogues now, declares that there will be the monthly consultation with civil society. These are very, very important openings in communications channels for non-governmental organizations, for civil society. So I'm going to stop there. I'm stopping a bit early because I know that the dialogues in the breakout rooms are going to be really important. You have so many experts in this audience. I know that you're going to find them really, really interesting. So please don't find yourselves bound by the questions that I've given you. My questions really are, I remember what they are. Oh, yeah. why do you think nonviolent solutions are more long-lasting? Why are they more effective, and why are they more long-lasting than violent, what we might call solutions, which really don't turn out to be solutions? So that's the first one. Second one is, were there ones in this discussion that particularly resonated with you that you would be able to use afterward in your own life? And you know what? I've misplaced these three, so I'm going to leave them up to the leaders in the breakout sessions. You've got your little list of 3 questions, but what I'm really interested in is to know from you how you would apply some of these ideas. What are the themes that have come out through the cases that I've talked about, and ones that you know, because many of you know nonviolent solutions that are being used all over the world. So what are the themes that come out again and again, and how can we apply those today to bring about the changes that we need? Because we truly are in a time of triple crises. We've got the pandemic of COVID-19, we've got the threat of climate change, and we've got the threat of nuclear war again, which is almost unbelievable. So how are we going to use these themes as we start to build new strategies? So I'm going to stop there. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mary-Wynne. So now we're going to transition to the breakout rooms, and we have some wonderful moderators that we've lined up from World Beyond War's staff and volunteers and board that have volunteered to help lead these breakout room discussions. So Phil, can you create the breakout rooms?
I sure can. They are all created, and you should be entering your breakout rooms.
All right, Mary-Wynne, would you like to kick us off with this report back section?
Here we go. Well, thank you. I have to first of all say how impressed I was. In fact, inspired by the number of people who are really, really active in their communities, and also by the number of people who are new to the whole peace movement and discussions around disarmament. That's really exciting for me to see. I'll just hit a couple of points. One that was made was that we need to, as individuals, we need to be sure that we're listening to the people who are suffering, whatever, whether it's the refugees and immigrants or those who are in unjust situations, that before we start giving advice, which we all love to jump in and do, we need to listen first. Second point was the important role of religion as a positive force for bringing people together, and in particular because it's presenting a kind of a moral structure for young people growing up. A couple of suggestions of particular actions, one against gun violence, where the groups made T-shirts with the names and ages of young people who had been killed and then presented those at the front of churches. Another comment was that all of the negativity is very, very disheartening for us, and we need to hear the positive stories. I totally agree with that, and I think we need to use social media now to get the positive actions out there so that everybody is aware that the things are changing for the better. We have to shift the story with it, was I thought a very interesting comment. The narrative of hatred that leads to war has to be countered by the narrative of love and justice. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Mary-Wynne. Helen Peacock, would you like to share the highlights from your breakout session?
Muted. Hi. We actually started off talking quite a bit about the Black-white divide in the US in particular, and the situation in Minneapolis with the young Black man who was killed. And there was sort of much discussion around how important it is to recognize that this was symptomatic of something far deeper, and to have a sense of the humanity of the perpetrator as well as the victim. And that the feeling was that now there's a condemnation of the police, of the perpetrator, that is sort of equally, is also violent in its nature, and that's not the way to go. And it comes back to the fact that if we can, one of our participants said it goes 100 levels deeper, and we have to come back to recognizing the humanity in everyone. If we make the other party wrong, we're going to create resistance, and that's not what we want to do. We want to create. We want to listen. We want to listen not just to the victim, but also to understand the needs of the perpetrators. That segued into domestic violence and hearing the voices of the silenced and understanding what was happening there. And some conversation around who says that so-and-so is a dictator. What does your dictator might be my strong authoritative leader. So we need to understand the languaging that we're using and what we mean by it. And then we switched sort of gears, and we talked quite a bit about the insights that we've gained and what we might apply ourselves. And we talked about humor and the mayor of Bogota and the wonderful role that humor can take. And I in particular want to use more humor in the work that I'm doing in Ontario, Canada. We talked about how in there are a lot of resources out there, and money is not a dirty word. And we can sort of connect to the various community resources that are out there. One of our participants worked at a place called the Recovery Cafe, and sort of have a better understanding of what's happening in our communities and be able to do that. And it made me think of connecting to people. I mean, another organization that does capital investments to finance solutions to some of these problems. We don't have to be poor and wearing cutoff jeans in a back alley to be looking for peace. We can connect with resources that would allow our reach to be even greater. So one person actually said, billionaires are not necessarily assholes. And then another person said that she didn't believe in billionaires, like Bernie Sanders says. So there was some discussion around that, and that we adopt more of a prosperity consciousness in what we're doing so that we attract more money to make the kinds of changes that we want to see in the world. We got into a conversation around wage discrepancies and the fact that we all know that this has happened, that in the last 20 or 30 years, the discrepancies between CEOs and workers has grown astronomically. One solution is transparency so that there's a better understanding. And we finished with our combined, our sense that we wanted to abolish the death penalty. It was kind of our final point. And I think I covered everything.
Great.
Thank you, Helen. David Swanson.
Can I add one more thing?
Would you like to share? Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead, Helen.
Helen, are you still?
Oh, I was just gonna add that I listened to a talk that Mary-Wynne did for TED. One more step, I will take one more step until there's peace for everyone. I won't sing it. And then she finishes as one more check. I will write one more check. I will write one more check until there is peace for everyone, which is how we ended. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice segue. I was going to talk about donations to World Beyond War. I mean, no, I wasn't. That was very interesting because a lot of what Helen said, we didn't talk about in our breakout room. I think we had very different breakout rooms, which is good. And when we pile it all together, it will be better. I do think hoarding $1 billion is deadly and immoral, although it's not a reason to call anyone an asshole. The very interesting thing about our breakout room is, number one, there were young people in it. Number two, there was no discussion of the desperate need to reach more young people, which I haven't been in any peace discussion in decades that didn't have that. And there was a great deal of discussion of the need to get more old people involved and active, and taking advantage of the advantages they have to risk arrest with less consequence to their lives than for some young people. So that was very interesting. And people went over a number of examples of nonviolent campaigns that I'll put in my notes. There was a lot of discussion coming out of the earlier examples of the power of humor and surprise and creativity. There was some discussion of environmentalism and peace as two movements that have a lot in common and should be working more together. And I mentioned that we have an online course on that topic coming up starting in July at World Beyond War. And we never really got around to what I was expecting to be a key answer to why nonviolence tends to work better, namely that more people get involved if a campaign is nonviolent. I think most people in our breakout room knew that, but I wanted to say it out loud. You get more people involved with nonviolence. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Rivera.
Are we?
Great, thank you. So like David, I want to just reiterate that the breakout rooms sound like they covered many different things, which is awesome. From Mary-Wynne's amazing presentation, we drew out a bunch of themes, including the critical role of women in peace building, and that using power over often escalates the problems while nonviolence breaks the mold. And in a tied-in way, many of the stories Mary shared had arresting, powerful visuals that helped to startle people almost into thinking about the issue in a totally different way, totally different paradigm. Also, the stories Mary-Wynne shared, several of them made it personal for people, like testing the mother's milk for strontium-90, which brings home the immediacy of the issue. There were things in the presentation that some of us had never heard the word of, such as track 2 diplomacy. So that was a revelation, an eye-opening thing for people. And also, you know, just seeing how powerful media, culture, and entertainment are to this. We talked a little bit about why nonviolent action is more likely to succeed, and came up with a couple other ideas to add to the network of ideas that have been shared. One, that nonviolence definitely can help to de-escalate violence, particularly in the context of struggle, which ironically helps to protect people from death, not universally, but can be a factor in lowering casualty rates compared to war. And nonviolence is creative while violence is destructive and harmful. So nonviolence often proposes a solution that kind of carries us through to the new paradigm that we want to live into. And also, nonviolence fertilizes the ability of people to find their own solutions, which is really a big thing when you're talking about moving forward. Why do things become more enduring? Lastly, on the third question, we had lots of ideas. I probably won't be able to name them all, but there was a lot of talk about cities for peace and the things that people who are in cities of peace are doing in conjunction with that, and also how to get your city council or mayor to become a mayor for peace or a city for peace, or make a nuke-free zone or a weapons of mass destruction-free zone. And then there was a lot of talk in our group about remembering to start with the children and to include all the ages in our work for peace. We also talked about the power of statistics and names and numbers, like the New York Times article that listed just a fraction of the deaths from COVID-19. And also about how we have powerful statistics on peace and nonviolence now that most people aren't aware of, but people are increasingly connecting with statistics as a source of information and paradigm shifting. So that can be added to the other narrative of changing stories, which is also an important medium. So I think last of all, we talked a little bit about the need for really thinking deeply about structural shifts around peace. So this includes things about how every city and every county and every state and has some kind of military or weapons making capacity. This is in the US specifically. And we invest in weapons, right? We invest in war, but we don't comparably invest in peace and nonviolence. So we're always working at a disadvantage in terms of the sheer numbers of that. And so how can we look at systems such as universities or city levels or unions even to really kind of work with that institutional level to make structural and systemic changes that start to shift the very large system in larger and larger ways. Thank you. And thank you to my group for all these wonderful suggestions. I didn't get to say that to you, but wow, it was very fruitful. So thank you.
It certainly sounded fruitful. Thank you.
Thanks, Rivera. John Ruhr. You'll need to unmute yourself.
We started with talking about the common thread being the need to stop cooperating with a normal that we don't want. If we're going to create a new way of doing things in the world, you've got to withdraw cooperation from doing it the old way and pattern a new thing. And the stories Mary told could be seen as what is Palmer Parker called second order change, or as I think of as kind of non-complementary behavior. When the women were in the McCarthy hearings, they brought so many new and things that created wonder, a state of wonder in the congressional chambers, that it ended the whole thing. It just didn't compute for them. They didn't follow the mold. They didn't cooperate. And that kind of creative and sometimes fun and humorous and non-complementarity takes non-cooperation from confrontational to a metanoia, to more open to change. Leaves people with, oh, I wonder what that means, and thinking in a new way, second order change. As far as why nonviolence more likely to bring change, our group mentioned the word cooperation more than anything else. That because it helps people cooperate rather than compete, it actually makes it easier, leading, of course, to the numbers that David said. It's just easier for people to participate when they don't have to risk quite as much. And I would add to that there's so much neurobiological evidence that we're hardwired for cooperation, really, as much as competition. Then as far as applying all these things, we had a couple of very strong voices, more than a couple actually, of really needing to give people, especially young people, an option to serve for peace like they serve for the military. And that could be either retraining the military or starting a peace service. There are strong movements that I hope that Suman and Saul will both share from Canada and India, working hard for departments of peace at the cabinet level in the countries. And then going further than that, actually have a Peace Corps, more along the lines of the Nonviolent Peace Force, and working towards civilian-based defense. And of course, that would require actually having academies where people train for many years in the ways of nonviolence that are so misunderstood, including the need for research and development. And I would just add to that, if we put any part of the military budget into that, it would be more money than any of us would know what to do with at start. But we're willing to accept the challenge. Yeah, I think that was the gist of it. I apologize for anything I left out from folks, but.
Super, thank you, John.
Thank you, John. Leah Bulger.
Yay, here I am.
Need to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yeah, I did. Okay, good. So yes, we had a good discussion. There were a lot of the same points that you all have made already. I can reiterate. the idea that the difference between why violence is less effective than nonviolence, we talked about the idea that that it doesn't take very many people, or one person can cause the violence, but in order to act nonviolently, it takes cooperation, it takes more people, and as David mentioned, more people involved in nonviolent resistance. So there requires some sort of a depth of understanding for the nonviolence to work. People have to understand the issue and the power of the cooperation and the non-cooperation. So I think that idea of relationships and building cooperation and collaboration was really stressed. That's very important. I like this point. Somebody said, you know, we always hear violence breeds violence, and he said nonviolence also breeds nonviolence, and people continue on the way that that's been shown in response. The idea that men are a big part of the problem came up with us too. I mentioned, and I'll mention it to all of you, that our latest edition of our Alternative Global Security System book, it has a new section on patriarchy and the role of patriarchy in causing war, and the role that women have played in creating peace. So there's something that we need to learn more about, because we know that's true, that women are critical. The idea that we are all world citizens, and that the pandemic has kind of shown us that the climate change issue, nuclear weapons, are three evils that Mary-Wynne explained. This is helping people understand in a more personal way, obvious way, day to day, that we are global citizens, and that we need to have a shift in our thinking, a paradigm shift of how we are as a group of humans, as a humanity, instead of citizens of this country or that country, or this ethnic group or that ethnic group. Creativity and humor, we agreed that was very important. And then we talked about just building one-on-one relationships. So one person talked about in her town having a series of anti-bias training with the police department, and sitting down one-on-one and creating those relationships. So it is interesting that one-on-one discussions can be very, very fruitful in seeing that the other side is really not what you might think they are when you stop to look at them in a more personal level. And the last thing, and I think this is really important, we talked about the just war theory that a lot of people have used, the Catholic creation of this just war theory that legitimizes war in certain cases, provided authority. And that really should be done away with. The Pope needs to talk about that not being in effect anymore and not being true. Religious leaders have an obligation, and they have a lot of power to affect people's mindset about war and what is legitimate and how we can be more effective with nonviolence. And I also apologize if I left any important things out, but I think that was it. A lot of the same themes that other people have spoken about. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leah.
Thanks, Leah. Okay, we have Mark Elliott Stein.
Right. Yeah, I really appreciated the conversations in my breakout room. And interestingly, we really covered very different topics from all of these. We did not talk about, George Floyd or track 2 diplomacy, and all of these would have been good topics. We had a lot of input from most of the people there, and we did focus a bit on Palestine and Gaza as a real world situation that we can measure the topic of nonviolence against. And I think it was good that Youssef in our group brought that up quickly, because it gave us a real tough nut to crack, because how do you how do you think about the suffering going on in Palestine right now, especially in what's happening in Gaza every week, with the nonviolent philosophy? And that got us right to the heart of the matter, which is, do we really believe in nonviolence as a movement? And that got us talking about what nonviolence is, and the fact that nonviolence is not passive acceptance. Certainly, it's quite the opposite of passive acceptance. Nonviolent is disruptive, provocative, confrontational resistance. And one person brought up something that's often spoken, which is that World War II and the Holocaust and you know what, the concentration camps, et cetera, is a case where nonviolence was not sufficient. And I personally spoke up to say, as David Swanson often has a great answer on this one, but I don't think it's true that anti-war activists should admit that nonviolence would not have helped in Europe in the 1930s and 1940s. I think quite the opposite is true. And that really got us thinking that we have a lot more talking to do about nonviolence. There was a quote, I don't remember who the person was, that nonviolence means to join in the suffering of the oppressed. I thought that was a good quote. We talked a bit about religion and about the fact that a religious background can often ground a person in nonviolence. And really talked about a lot more, and we could have gone on. So it was a very good discussion, and I think we brought up some big topics.
Wow, thank you, Mark. Yeah.
Okay, Mary Ellen.
Thank you. Well, interestingly, in my group, the focus for quite a while was really on our present reality of the pandemic, and it's bringing us more and more online. So reflecting on what kind of creative energy can there be online. There was some concern for the existence of some really good youth structures and campaigns prior to the pandemic, and that then there was kind of a loss of energy. So wondering what could help to bring that energy back and that solidarity amongst the youth. I think most people then were speaking to this time of pandemic and being online as a time for groups to be in solidarity, to bring people together, civil society groups, to organize, to strategize, to look at what has worked in the past and what could be working in the future. It's like really building through being together online for when we can start to move out again. There was some concerns about youth and their education and what can inspire them. And so there were thoughts of inspiring leaders or artists like rap singers. But then as one person said, certainly all of that is valuable, but we can't keep looking to persons or energies outside of ourselves, that it's really our responsibility to go within and do our own internal work, so that we don't lose our enthusiasm or we don't lose our energy to persevere in this work. Perhaps in relationship to shifting stories, one younger person said that violence is really the absence of love and friendship and collaboration. And so, you know, we could be shifting energies for all of us if we all started to give more attention to developing relationships of love and of friendship and collaboration with all other persons. There certainly was, and it could be tied to the organizing and the strategizing going on now, that can be going on now. You know, the whole idea of the money that goes into militarism and how that money could be used. So I think that kind of allies with the whole movement of move the money. Yes, another youth really talked about education being key, especially for youth. And I think what was mentioned about our time online is that this gives us an opportunity to be linking into all kinds of webinars where we can be learning many new things to build on our planning for the future. So I think that's pretty well a summary of what we did in our group.
Thank you very much, Mary Ellen. That was just, I've got pages of notes here. Thank you, everyone.
Yes, and we also had a fruitful discussion in the main room for those of us that didn't join a breakout room. A lot of what's been said already, we talked about as well. We talked about the use of humor and how that was really interesting to see how effective humor can be in real world situations. And in general, kind of the effectiveness of nonviolence through the use of creativity, the arts, kind of the playful side of humanity. We talked a lot about the role of women in peace building, building off of what you had said, Mary-Wynne, about the presence of women being a positive indicator for ending war and promoting peace, and then kind of talking through as a group, why is that? Why is there that correlation between when women are present and it seems to be less violent? And kind of, we talked about this discussion of, is that because of this role of women in society as the nurturer, as the motherly role? And then we got into some interesting conversations. One person shared from their experience in law enforcement, how women in law enforcement are often able to diffuse a situation without the use of force. But then we also heard about this idea that at the same time, women can perpetuate patriarchy, the system of patriarchy, through the example one participant shared of this kind of stereotype of, I want a man who doesn't cry. I want a macho man, and how that's kind of propping up patriarchy as well. So we can all be victim to falling into these ways of thinking. And then in terms of talking about, why is nonviolence more effective and long lasting, we talked about how violence creates winners and losers. So violence inherently separates people and creates resentment. And so it's hard to overcome that. Of course, and then the obvious death and destruction that comes through the use of violence and force. And then we kind of concluded with, discussion of the COVID crisis currently and how we have this potential opportunity to, I think as someone said, press the reset button and to make these linkages between war and the environment, and how, a lot of the environmental destruction that's currently happening can be traced back to the role of the military being one of the top polluters on Earth. And also, with the pandemic, talking about the enormous military budget. And someone brought up the example of it's happened in a lot of cities worldwide where our heroes, in the hospitals, the healthcare workers, are being thanked by having fighter jets flying over them, and just thinking like, how is that a sign of, of thanking people when that's using up millions, if not billions of dollars, and of course fossil fuels to fly those fighter jets. So that was just a very brief summary of our rich conversation in the main room, and also lots and lots of notes coming through in the chat that we'll compile later. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. Now is it my turn again, Greta?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. I've got pages of notes written here actually, and there are a couple of things that I want to pick up on with other tiny short stories that I think illustrate them. People were talking about how starting to have dialogue opens up a space where peace can then be considered. And in the 1980s and early 90s, there was a whole campaign that resulted from Dr. James Grant, who was then the head of UNICEF. And he called on the world to declare humanitarian ceasefires in war zones so that teams of healthcare workers could go in and immunize children. And that campaign actually went through and all over the world and resulted in a massive improvement in immunizations. And particularly it's important for things like polio and measles, which some people still think is a minor disease, but it in fact kills children in the developing world because they're malnourished. So the example that I think of is in El Salvador. And this is also an example of how these changes are not permanent. We have to keep working on them generation after generation. But at that time, James Grant went and spoke to the military, to the army, and said, we want you to stop fighting because we need this humanitarian ceasefire. And the army said, no, because we don't acknowledge the rebels, and so we can't possibly have an agreement. However, for these 3 days, we won't fight. He went out into the jungle and he spoke to the rebel leaders and called for this ceasefire. And they said, no, we don't recognize this as a legitimate government, so we can't have an agreement with them. However, on these 3 days, we won't fight. So they were able to go in and immunize the children. And then they had to do it again 3 months later and 3 months after that for the booster shots. Each time, instead of having to go for James Grant to have to go out into the jungle and so on, the groups came closer together until finally they were all in the same room. So you can guess what happened was they finally started to talk to each other. And there was, in the end, a ceasefire. That's not to say it was perfect. It was not lasting forever, but it is an example of what happens when you do bring together people to listen. Then someone pointed out in one-on-one meetings, you have to remember the person across from you is not the enemy. And I cannot tell you, I've been working on this peace and nonviolence now for 38 years. And if there's one lesson that I still have to learn, it's that the person across the table from me is not the enemy, because when they start ranting, I go, and you have to stop when that's happening. Take a deep breath and let the God in you speak to the God in them. It's not easy work, is it? You all know that it's not easy work, but it is so important. And the story that I would tell was about a particular consultative group that the Canadian government set up, a very, very forward-thinking group from Doug Roche, our ambassador at the time. He brought together 50 people. 1/3 were admirals and generals from the military. 1/3 were senior from the Foreign Affairs Department, and 1/3 were peace people. So we were required, the military people could not wear uniform, which made them exceedingly vulnerable and nervous. The peace people were really threatened by meeting with all of these characters from authority. And we were required to sit at tables that were mixed with every different kind of person. And I knew all those military guys were the enemy. So I was really had all of my barriers up, and ended up becoming a really good friend of one of the generals. We were asked to debate on television, and it turned out to be a very, very friendly debate that was enormously popular on TV out here in Victoria, because we argued from our own sides, but we both agreed on almost everything. So that's just a few of my comments from your wonderful, rich discussions, and I thank you. So now for the last part of this, we have about 20 minutes left. I really think we need to put this into the context of this present time. This is a time when, as I said before, we're facing a global pandemic. We're facing new investments in nuclear weapons, new threats of nuclear weapons, as if they can be used on the battlefield, as if they would win in a war, as if there were some kind of winning that would result. And the destruction of the climate. And in particular, for me, it's the connection between global militarization and the destruction of our climate, and that we simply have to stop the major role of militaries, not only the expenditures, but the literal destruction of climate that's caused by them, being the world's greatest polluters, greatest producers of greenhouse gases, and the greatest users of petroleum products. So what I want to do is just, and we won't rush this discussion unless you're just bursting with discussion questions, but to have some thoughts about what do we do now while people are frightened, while they're despairing, while they are really, really anxious about what does the future hold? If there's no jobs or difficult to find the job that you're suited for, what's the economic situation going to be? Am I going to survive if there is this virus around for a year or two? All of these are really overwhelming questions. And in the midst of it, we're calling for peace. And I think that the Secretary General of the United Nations has given us a really wonderful rallying focus, and that is global ceasefires during this pandemic, especially, but hopefully with the thought that that would be long lasting. So I'm going to be quiet and open it and let Greta be the moderator. I will make comments if there's something that I can add, but I think probably most of it's going to come from you.
Thanks, Mary-Wynne. Well, we have a lot of questions that have already been coming in and lots of great thoughts in the chat, which we'll be compiling afterwards. One question which we had been discussing in our breakout room as well is, can you talk a little bit more about why you think women are effective in the peace building process, or why the presence of women is correlated with more, the effective use of nonviolence?
Yeah, I think one of the most worthwhile things that I have read, I'll just talk about. There's a book by Deborah Tannen, who I think is a linguist, who wrote, or not a, I forget what the right term of her profession is. Anyway, she's a professor. She wrote a book called You Just Don't Understand. And it's about the different way that men and women speak to each other, communicate with physical communications or verbal communications. And they did research that traces the differences between us right down to childhood. And I'll just give a quick example, studying little boys on videotape. When two little boys are put in a room and they're just sitting on two little chairs, they're not told what to do. They face forward, they don't talk to each other. Sometimes they poke each other. And then if they do start to converse, they converse facing forward. Little girls immediately turn their chairs to face each other and start talking to each other. What's interesting to me, and I'm saying this from memory, so I may have screwed it up, and my apologies to the author, but afterward, they were asking men and women their views of watching these interactions on video. And the men said, the boys were just great. Those girls were just so prissy and awful. They just could hardly stand to watch it. And the women said, look at those little girls. They're just cooperating and talking, and look at those boys. Isn't that typical of boys? They start by poking each other. So these things are part of maybe it's part of the way we're cultured, I don't know, but it's really pervasive. So in negotiations, when women are there, the tone of the negotiations changes. The United Nations has said at some point in an article I read that if you have more than 1/3 of the group is female, the tone of the entire discussion will change and you'll get a more collaborative result. So there is something that's innate. There's also something about the way that women confront difficulties. And perhaps it's because we don't have the physical strength to confront difficulties physically. We have to negotiate, sometimes with humor, with distraction, with new ideas. and I think of when I first started working in the peace movement, one of the significant differences between working with Voice of Women and working with IPFNW, which was at the international level, mainly men. I was the only woman on the board for a long time. The difference that I noticed was the way that the room was set up to begin with, and that the women took away the desks and tables and put the chairs in a circle and put flowers in the middle of the room. The men sat at a podium at the front, and the rest of the group sitting down below, or if it was just 20 people around a table, but with a hierarchy of speakers. So there are changes now that we've seen. I mean, it's been 38 years. Now we see groups everywhere, business groups meet in a circle. All of these things, I think, maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's the influence of more and more women being involved and asking for flattening hierarchies and having more circular collaboration.
Thanks, Mary-Wynne, and I would encourage everyone to keep putting more questions in the chat. Another question that came up here, building off of that past one, is can you provide some specific examples of the ways that nuclear weapons have disproportionately impacted women and girls?
Yes, I speak then as a physician. The effect of radiation is much more severe on women and particularly on fetuses. So women are more sensitive to radiation. The production of healthy pregnancies is very much damaged by radiation at lower levels than we would expect, and at lower levels than is affecting men. Excuse me. Women also are left, in the event of a major catastrophe, such as, and I'm thinking of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, women are left without income, without ways to reconstruct their lives when they are left alone, and that with the responsibility for raising children and finding food and so on, that all of those responsibilities fall onto the women, making it much more difficult. That's just off the top of my head.
Thank you. A quick question. Can you repeat the name of the mayor of Bogota that you had mentioned before?
Yes. His name is Antonis Maccas, Antanas, Antonis Maccas, Mockus. And the Harvard Review is the article that I really like. There's lots of articles.
All right, another question coming in. Does patriarchy reinforce the use of violence as a way to legitimate war?
Yes, it does. Yeah, I mean, I can elaborate on that for a few hours, but one of the things Deborah Tannen noted in her book is that men are establishing, in their conversations, men are establishing their positions like this. Women are trying to find ways not to be above the other person, but to make everybody equal and everyone included, while men are establishing this hierarchy. And war is simply an expression of male domination of one leader over another. I want to mention one other thing before I forget it, and that is a super book to read called The Crime of Aggression by Noah Weisbord, Weisbord. This is a newly recognized crime at the International Criminal Court. It criminalizes leaders who initiate acts of war. They are held personally liable. So it means that if a leader gives an order for a drone attack to do murder in a different country, that leader is guilty of the crime of aggression. The other countries within the criminal court, any one of them can bring charges against that leader. And if the leader is not in a country that's in the criminal court, such as the US is not, if that leader travels to a country that is a member of the criminal court, that country is obliged to arrest him and send him to The Hague. So this is a huge, huge change in international law, and I really recommend the book. It's gripping reading, actually. It's really quite fascinating. Okay.
Thanks. And lots more questions coming in about this discussion of the role of women. So there's a question here about, we've talked about the role of women in conflict resolution and peace building, but what about the role of non-binary gender identities, like people who identify, either as non-binary or as transgender? Kind of, where does that fit in with this discussion of women versus men?
Doesn't fit into a discussion of women versus men. I think it comes into a discussion of being human. And as human beings, whoever we are, with whatever sexuality or whatever identification we have, whatever ethnicity, we still have a responsibility for our humanity and to build peace and respect and love and caring for everyone without any exclusions.
Thank you. The next question is about hierarchy. Is hierarchy inherently bad? Does hierarchy necessitate violence?
I don't think hierarchy necessitates violence, and there are times when you have to have a hierarchy. An example is in a fire department, you have to have someone who's giving orders, and probably similarly in police departments, similarly in and I'm speaking as a retired doctor. So for you doctors out there who are in practice, this is when I was involved in when there's a cardiac code, a cardiac arrest called, and you are running to help. And at that time it took 4 people. One person has to be in charge. So sometimes you have to have hierarchy. That does not mean that you have to enforce hierarchical position with force, with violence.
Thank you. Someone mentions war tax resistance, and specifically speaking from a US perspective, but this could be applied to other countries as well, given how much of our taxes, federal taxes, go to prop up the military. Have you done any work with war tax resistance? Would you support people withholding their taxes in order not to support war?
It's surely a challenging thing to do. In Canada, we had a case of doctor, someone will have to remember the name for me because I'm having a senior moment here. An endocrinologist from Vancouver who did not pay her taxes, and it went to court. I think it went all the way to the Supreme Court, where she had put the money aside in a trust account but didn't pay it in her taxes. And in the end, she was required to pay it in her taxes. It's typically Quakers in Canada who were doing this through Conscience Canada. And it raised the awareness of everyone about the amount of our money, individual money, that is going to build a military machine that we don't want. We really don't want that. That's not how to build a good society. So I support it, but I recognize that it's very risky. It's very risky for Americans, especially, I think, that you might end up in jail doing it. And I think you need to think carefully. It's like all civil disobedience. You have to think very, very carefully about what are the consequences of this action and what will be the benefits.
Thanks. Going back to the discussion of women, someone asks about the increasing role of women in the military. And in the US, we've seen that, increasing kind of dialogue about letting women participate equally. And then a lot of anti-war groups, including World Beyond War, saying, we don't want anyone to be drafted, not men or women. So what do you think are the implications of this kind of push to get women more involved in the military?
I think it's an unfortunate thing that many women go into the military because it is a job. It is a guaranteed job with good pay compared to other things that they can do. And my stance is against war. I think in the end, we're going to need some kind of international, I don't want to call it military force, but an international police, perhaps, is a better word, so that when we do establish peace, that we have ways to enforce that. But I don't believe that we have the right to be bombing outside our own countries. You know, I do agree with the idea of civil-based defense, that we can defend our country inside of our borders, but going outside is war. And whether it's men or women, it's something that needs to change. And women need to be given other opportunities to excel in the ways that everybody can excel.
A question from a former Marine asks, how can we organize to demand that the U.S. disavows its veto vote on the National Security Council and that the International Criminal Court actually establishes an authentic presence in the U.S.?
Oh, just the thing that I'm so fascinated by right now. I recommend tuning in on these dialogues with the president of the Security Council, whoever he is, because they seem to be on our side. They are absolutely, totally despairing and disheartened, excuse me, by the fact that this is now how many months since the beginning of this pandemic, and the Security Council is unable to issue a statement about the pandemic and the need to have humanitarian ceasefires, which they support, but they can't get a statement because countries are blocking, using their veto, unless the source of the virus is named. So this is ridiculous game playing with people's lives. I mean, this is really terrible what we're observing. How we get rid of the veto, there's so much wonderful ferment about restructuring the United Nations and how that might happen. And again, another book that I'm just reading, I think it's called Global Governance and the Emergence of Global Institutions in the 21st Century. It's an award-winning book, 550 pages long, and I'm only on page 78. So I can't tell you anything except it's so fascinating. I am just gobbling it up. Looking at the history of various movements to establish world governance and eventually ending with the United Nations, how the United Nations was deliberately set up to fail, that the General Assembly would not have the authority that it would need, and the Security Council would have this veto. So it was deliberately set up so that the great powers would maintain control. That was a revelation to me. I'm too naive to have thought of that myself. But I think this is a really fruitful place for us to be looking to the organizations that are working with the UN and saying, how do we help? How do we get a civil society action here? Because there are many, many proposals, and I won't go into them now, but they're really exciting.
A question from Rivera. Rivera asks, what are some key shifts that we can make in the peace movement at this time? We have track records of waging peace powerfully, even under authoritarian regimes. What can we learn from and apply from those situations for these times?
I think the one thing that I have completely forgotten is the power of music. And I'm very much aware of this because I wrote an article for Medicine, Conflict, and Survival about the talks we were giving in high schools and what happened when, instead of just giving our talk with slides, we put choir singing in the middle with participation from the kids. So we added in, all we are saying is give peace a chance and we shall overcome. It changed the dynamic in the room totally. Normally we were speaking to about 200 students in grade 9 and 10, sometimes grade 11. It changed the dynamic in the room so that those kids immediately went to the library to get more resources, and they started giving talks in their other classes. So there was such a transformation that I would say, make sure every meeting you have includes music.
Thanks, Mary-Wynne. And we're just about out of time. So would you like to give some concluding remarks?
Yes, I would like to say that I see this time as a time of great hope. And I know that I keep listening to the radio and people are saying how depression and suicidal ideation have gone up and up and up. I see this as a time of transformation, a time of opportunity. The world is going in two directions at the same time. One direction is toward peace, justice, human rights, equality of men and women, equality of all of the races and ethnicities, and just social justice in itself. And the other force, of course, is toward increasing domination by force, funneling the money all to a small group of men at the top, and the forces of division and hatred in our society. So if we focus ourselves on the direction that we want to end up, that's where we'll be the most effective. And that's where people will join us because we've got the hope. There's not much hope in racism and destruction, but there's lots of hope in collaboration, in peace building, in working toward a better world. And especially with the young people, I love that they're asking for more elderly people to be involved. That's the question that I get when I speak at universities. They say, well, tell us how to get the old people involved. And I think we've been trying so hard to get you involved. It's a matter of us talking to each other now. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Mary-Wynne. That's a wrap for today,
Oh,
day one.
no, I have a final slide. I don't even have to show the slide. I can just read it to you. Just a sec. This is a poem by Seamus Heaney. History says, don't hope on this side of the grave, but then once in a lifetime, the longed for tidal wave of justice can rise up and hope and history rhyme. So hope for a great sea change on the far side of revenge. Believe that a further shore is reachable from here. Believe in miracles and cures and healing wells.
Thank you, Mary-Wynne, and thank you everyone for joining us for day one of No War 2020. I really, really appreciate all of the amazing comments in the chat, and we'll try to respond to those afterwards, and we'll send a follow-up email to all of the registrants with links and additional resources, as well as the link to the recording of this session. So we hope you can join us tomorrow for day 2 of No War 2020. You can use the same Zoom link that you used today to join us tomorrow from 3 p.m. to 6 p.m. Eastern Time. And we will be having 2 back-to-back panel presentations. The first one talking about how to organize against a weapons expo, and we'll hear from activists from New Zealand, from the UK, and from Canada about their experiences shutting down weapons expos in their communities and how you can take those lessons learned and apply them to your own community to shut down a weapons expo in your area. And the second panel will be from 4:30 to 6 p.m. Eastern Time tomorrow, and we'll be talking about economic conversion and how we can convert from a war economy to a peace economy. And while doing that, make sure that the future that we want to see is just, peaceful, and green. So we look forward to seeing you all on Zoom tomorrow. Thanks.
Thank you.